Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
I raised my glass of champagne, the bubbly clinking softly against the rim as our small circle of family and close friends raised theirs too, smiles spreading across their faces. It was one of those picture-perfect nights. A cozy, candlelit dinner at a warm, rustic restaurant tucked away in our town, the kind with brick walls, dim Edison bulbs, and old Frank Sinatra songs humming faintly through the speakers. My fiancé, Mark, had just given a short, slightly awkward but sweet toast about love and future and finally making an honest woman out of Cassie, which made everyone chuckle. My mom had teared up. My dad had given that proud dad nod across the table. And then, just as everyone leaned back in their chairs and the server began bringing out the first round of dinner plates, my sister Emily cleared her throat, stood up, and casually dropped a bomb like she was reading the specials menu. "I'm pregnant." There was this half-second of confused silence, one of those suspended moments where your brain tries to catch up to what your ears just heard, before everyone collectively reacted. My mother gasped loud enough to make the couple at the next table glance over. My dad blinked hard and muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Mark, who was mid-sip, choked slightly on his wine, and I sat there frozen, my fingers still curled around my champagne glass, my face a practiced mask of polite interest that I could feel cracking at the edges. Emily didn't even look flustered. She gave a little laugh, the kind she uses when she wants to sound surprised at her own actions, though I've known her long enough to know there was nothing spontaneous about this moment. She smoothed her hand over her stomach, barely rounded at all, and said something about it being early days, but we're just so excited. Her boyfriend Michael grinning sheepishly next to her like he'd won a prize at the fair. People started murmuring congratulations, clinking glasses again, the excitement drifting away from Mark and me like a balloon slipping loose from a child's wrist. My mom was already peppering Emily with questions. "How far along are you? Have you seen a doctor? Do you want the name of mine?" And the whole table was pivoting, redirecting, rewiring itself around this new, unexpected centerpiece. Then, as I leaned slightly toward Emily, still clutching the stem of my glass, she leaned in toward me too, lips barely parted, and whispered so only I could hear, "This night needed some real news." That was the moment, right there. I didn't say anything back, didn't even blink, just turned my face slowly to hers and smiled, tight-lipped, teeth barely showing, the kind of smile you reserve for people you're plotting to run over with a minivan. Mark must have noticed something shift in me, because his hand slid over mine under the table, and he whispered, "You okay?" I nodded, said I was fine, but I wasn't, not even close. See, this wasn't just about a pregnancy announcement. This was Emily's way of making sure that, even on a night that was supposed to be mine, my milestone, my moment, she could twist it just enough to shine the light back on herself. And she knew exactly what she was doing. She's always known. She did it at my college graduation when she told everyone about her early acceptance to med school. She did it at my housewarming when she brought homemade cupcakes that had Emily's famous recipe printed on little flags. And now, on the night Mark and I finally celebrated our engagement after 2 long years of postponements and planning and saving and family stress, she stood up and set fire to it all with 2 smug little words. I watched her bask in the attention, watched Michael rub her back like she'd just run a marathon, watched my mom's eyes light up with dreams of grandchildren and baby showers and nursery colors. And I sat there with a dull ache in my chest, wondering why the hell she couldn't have waited just one more night. Dinner dragged. Every toast after that had to include the happy couple and the mom-to-be. Every bite of my perfectly cooked salmon tasted like cardboard. When dessert came, some kind of fancy apple tart I'd picked because Mark loves cinnamon, Emily's was brought out with a little sparkler on top. "For the new mama," the waitress said brightly. I don't blame the server. She was just doing her job. But I had to excuse myself to the bathroom before I snapped the spoon in my hand. In the ladies' room, I locked the stall and stared down at my heels, trying to remember what the night was supposed to feel like. I could hear 2 women laughing in the mirror area, talking about how beautiful Emily looked and how lucky she was. No one said anything about me. No one remembered this was my engagement dinner. When I finally stepped out, my lipstick smudged, I saw Emily standing at the sink, fixing her hair in the mirror. She didn't look at me, just said, with a smug little smile, "You're not me, are you?" Like I was being silly, like I was being petty for wanting a single night that wasn't about her. I didn't answer her. Just looked at her reflection in the mirror and said, "Not yet." And I meant it. The thing about being overshadowed your whole life by someone who thinks everything they do is more important, more exciting, more worth celebrating. Eventually, it catches up to you. Eventually, you get tired of swallowing it all, of being the bigger person. That night, after Mark and I got home and the house was quiet, we sat on the couch in our formal clothes, our untouched leftovers in a box on the coffee table. I stared at my engagement ring, twisting it slowly on my finger, and then I said it. "I want to change our wedding date." Mark blinked. "What? Why?" I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Because if Emily wants the spotlight so badly, she can have it, but not the way she thinks." He didn't understand at first, but he would, soon. The next morning, the house was quiet in that thick, uncomfortable way it gets after something emotional has been left unresolved, like the walls are holding their breath, waiting to see what happens next. The smell of stale champagne clung faintly to the kitchen towels we'd used to wipe down the counter before bed, and the engagement cards still stood neatly propped on the table, as if they were trying to remind us what the night had originally been about. I sat at the kitchen island with my fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee I hadn't touched, watching the sunlight crawl slowly up the cabinets, and feeling like someone had scooped out the insides of me and replaced them with something cold and hollow. Mark came in behind me, still barefoot, his hair a mess of soft waves flattened on one side from sleep, and when he put his hand on my shoulder, it wasn't in the gentle, comforting way I was used to. It was cautious, like he was trying to feel out the emotional temperature of the room before he said anything. He didn't speak right away, which I appreciated, because the last thing I needed was more words. Words had been flying around my head all night, some loud and angry, others quiet and mocking, most of them wrapped in Emily's voice. I kept hearing that moment in my head, like a broken recording stuck on repeat, the smug lift of her eyebrows, the whisper that slid between her teeth like it was meant to be a secret but cut through me like a knife. This night needed some real news. I hadn't even known how to react in that moment. Hadn't had the words or the fire or the calm fury I usually relied on when dealing with my sister. And so I'd smiled, which felt like the biggest betrayal of all, because it let her think she'd gotten away with it, again. "Are you okay?" Mark finally asked, his voice low and unsure. And I wanted to say no, not even a little, but instead I just nodded, took a sip of the coffee that tasted like ash, and said, "I'm just tired." And that wasn't a lie. I was tired of always being the one who had to shrug it off, to make peace, to let things go for the sake of family harmony, tired of being expected to share the spotlight with someone who had never once asked if I was okay with it. I'd spent years convincing myself that Emily didn't mean to overshadow me, that it was just bad timing or poor judgment or a craving for attention she didn't know how to manage. But after last night, after that look in her eyes, I knew better. She knew exactly what she was doing, and worse, she thought I wouldn't do anything about it. Mark leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me with that quiet patience he always had when he sensed I was working something out in my head. "Do you want to talk to her?" he asked, and I shook my head, maybe a little too hard. The last thing I wanted to do was give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. That was her game, chaos, drama, tears that came on command. And I wasn't playing it anymore. Instead, I picked up my phone, opened our group chat, and stared at the messages from last night. The congratulations, the hearts, the baby emojis that had suddenly taken over. I scrolled past the picture my mom had sent of Emily holding her wine glass to her stomach, everyone laughing around her like we were all in on some beautiful joke, and I felt something snap, not in a violent way, but in a clear, final way. like a string pulled too tight that simply couldn't hold anymore. I opened a new message and typed, "Hey, just curious. Did you plan to tell everyone last night, or did it just feel like the right moment?" It was short, polite, the kind of message that carried just enough weight to let her know I wasn't stupid, but not enough to start a full-blown fight. The typing dots appeared almost instantly. She was waiting for me. That, more than anything, told me she knew. Her reply was almost insultingly casual. "Honestly, it just kind of happened. We were going to wait, but Michael got excited. Hope it didn't ruin your night." I stared at the message for a full minute, reading it over and over until the words blurred into each other, and then I locked my phone and set it down. Hope it didn't ruin your night. Like we were talking about bad lighting or a slow waiter, not a calculated moment of attention theft that would be remembered long after the desserts were cleared. Mark watched me, waiting. "So what now?" And I said it again, this time with more clarity. "We changed the date." He didn't answer right away, probably because his mind was still stuck on the idea that weddings were supposed to be planned with joy, not weaponized like chess pieces in a family rivalry. But I wasn't in the mood to ease him into this. "We move the wedding," I continued more firmly. "We pick a date that works for us. And if it happens to land on the same day as Emily's baby shower, well," I sipped my coffee, finally, the bitterness now matching the mood in my chest. "I'm sure she'll understand. After all, things just kind of happen, right?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack," I said, and this time I smiled. Only it wasn't tight or fake or forced. It was the kind of smile that said I was done playing nice. I didn't need to scream or cry or throw a tantrum. I didn't need to confront Emily or demand an apology she'd never mean. What I needed was to remind her that she wasn't the only one who could flip the script. If she wanted to steal my moment, then she could watch me take it back, calmly, elegantly, and with just enough petty precision to make it unforgettable. The phone buzzed again. Emily, of course. "Are you coming to brunch? Mom says she's making waffles." I didn't respond. I just stood up, walked over to Mark, wrapped my arms around his waist, and said, "We should pick out a new date today, something that feels right." He looked down at me, amused, a little wary. "And if it overlaps?" I kissed his cheek. "Then I guess we're just going to have a really eventful Saturday." And in that moment, the cold emptiness inside me began to shift, not into warmth exactly, but into something sharper, more focused. I wasn't going to fight for the spotlight anymore. I was going to build my own damn stage. The day we chose the new wedding date was unassuming in every outward way. Clear skies, mild temperatures, the kind of late spring afternoon that smells faintly of freshly cut grass and distant barbecues. But beneath the surface, it carried a quiet charge, like the hour before a summer storm rolls in. Not violent yet, but inevitable and creeping. Mark and I sat at the kitchen table with our laptops open and our shared calendar pulled up between us. An innocent domestic scene, if not for the slightly wicked gleam in my eye and the increasing tension that had been slowly tightening around my shoulders since Emily's little stunt. Mark, ever the diplomat, had voiced his concerns not because he didn't support me, but because he knew what I was capable of when pushed. And he wasn't sure if this was about reclaiming a moment or starting a war. But I knew the truth. This wasn't a war. Not yet, anyway. This was a course correction, a statement of boundaries long overdue. For too many years, Emily had been allowed to make the rules, bend the expectations, and rewrite the family narrative to suit her needs. While I played the role of the stable one, the forgiving one, the sister who swallowed her pride for the sake of keeping the peace. I wasn't angry because she was pregnant. I was angry because she weaponized that pregnancy to steal the only night that was supposed to be about me, and did it with the smug assurance of someone who assumed, correctly until now, that I would never retaliate. That assumption was about to be challenged. When I opened the calendar and hovered over the weekend slots in late June, my fingers paused deliberately on one date that made my breath catch slightly, not from surprise, but from the slow satisfaction of a move clicking perfectly into place. "June 22nd, I said aloud, pretending to consider it casually, though I knew exactly what I was doing. Mark leaned over, glanced at it, and gave a low whistle. "Isn't that?" I nodded, smiling without looking up. "Yep, Emily's baby shower." He leaned back, crossing his arms, his expression unreadable for a few seconds before he finally said, "You really want to do this?" And it wasn't a question of logistics or morality. It was about motive, about what kind of person I was choosing to be in response to what kind of person, Emily had already shown herself to be. I could still change my mind. I could still let it go, but I didn't want to. Not anymore. "I'm not doing this to be cruel," I said, and I meant it. "I'm doing it because I'm tired of pretending her choices don't affect everyone else." So we sent the emails, we updated the wedding website, we made the calls to vendors, most of whom were thrilled to accommodate the earlier date since it freed up prime fall weekends. And then we told our families. My parents were the first hurdle. I could hear the hesitation in my mother's voice, even before I told her the actual date, like she sensed I wasn't calling just to chat about seating charts or centerpieces. When I finally said it, there was a long pause on the line. "But that's Emily's baby shower," she said, and I could hear the gentle panic creeping into her tone, the motherly instinct to prevent conflict at all costs. "I know," I said calmly, "and I'm sure she'll understand." There was another pause, and I could almost hear the mental gymnastics she was doing, trying to find a polite way to say what she wanted to say without making me feel attacked. "Don't you think people will have to choose?" she asked finally. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "I think people can decide what matters to them, just like Emily did." My father, on the other hand, surprised me. When I told him, he didn't flinch or question it. He just said, "About time you stood your ground." And I nearly cried. Because for once, someone saw me not as the troublemaker, not as the instigator, but as someone finally drawing a line in the sand, after years of pretending it didn't exist. The fallout didn't take long. Emily called that evening, though called might be the wrong word, because she didn't so much talk as erupt. I could hear the tension in her voice from the first syllable, like she'd been waiting all day for the chance to let it boil over. "Are you serious, Cassie?" she demanded, skipping over any greeting or preamble. "You're moving your wedding to the same day as my baby shower?" I could have played dumb. I could have said something about availability, or vendor schedules, or fate, but I didn't. I was done pretending. "Yes," I said, "I am." "You don't think that's a little petty?" I laughed, quietly but genuinely. "Petty? You mean like announcing a pregnancy at someone else's engagement dinner and then whispering, 'This night needed real news'? Is that the kind of petty you're referring to?" There was silence, thick and hot, and I knew I had struck the nerve I was aiming for. Look, it wasn't like that," she said finally, her voice slipping into that performative guilt she used when she wanted to appear hurt without actually apologizing. "I didn't plan it that way." "But you did," I said, softly but with finality. "And now I'm making a choice, just like you did." She didn't yell after that. She just breathed into the phone for a few seconds, the kind of breathing that says, "There's a lot being held back." And then she said, "You're going to regret this," and hung up before I could respond, but I didn't, not even a little. The next morning, the RSVP emails started coming in. Some people were confused. A few politely asked if there had been a mix-up, but the overwhelming response was positive. Friends who had seen what happened at the engagement dinner and wanted to support us. Family members who knew this wedding had been a long time coming and deserved its own space. And while I knew there'd be fallout, I also knew, deep in my gut, that for the first time in a long time, I was no longer standing in Emily's shadow. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was creating the story. And as far as I was concerned, this was just the opening chapter. The morning of the shower wedding doubleheader arrived cloaked in the kind of quiet tension you don't recognize until you're in the middle of it. The kind that hums underneath everything, not loud or dramatic, but steady, heavy, unshakable, like a low drumbeat in your chest that makes every word feel sharper and every silence feel stretched too thin. I woke up earlier than I needed to, which wasn't surprising given the weeks of mounting pressure and the way my nerves had slowly curled themselves into knots I'd been pretending I didn't feel. The house was still, the light filtering in through the blinds soft and gray, and for a moment, I sat at the edge of the bed staring at the floor, wondering, not for the first time, if I had crossed some invisible line between standing up for myself and becoming exactly what Emily had always accused me of being: jealous, vindictive, unable to let go. But that moment passed quickly, swallowed by the memory of her smug whisper and the mocking smile she wore like perfume, and by the far louder truth that no one, not even a sister who shared your blood and history, had the right to strip you of your dignity just because they expected you to smile and take it. I had made a choice, and if the cost of that choice was Emily's discomfort, then perhaps for once she could be the one to squirm in a room where the attention didn't belong solely to her. Mark was calm, almost too calm, which I suppose made sense given how much of our relationship had been built around my storms, and his anchor-like ability to keep both of us from drifting too far off course. He helped with the final touches, the last-minute centerpiece adjustments, the backup plan in case of rain, the playlist we debated for hours, and when I paused in the mirror to fix my hair and check the veil, he came up behind me, placed his hands on my shoulders, and said quietly, "No matter what happens today, we did this our way." Those words carried more weight than he knew, because today wasn't just about vows or cake or rings. It was about setting a precedent. It was about rewriting years of unspoken rules, where one person got to dictate how every family gathering, every celebration, every milestone unfolded, while the other learned to live with the echo of applause meant for someone else. Today, I had rewritten the rules. The ceremony was set for noon, modest in size but not in sentiment, with chairs lined up neatly, under the blooming canopy of an old oak in my parents' backyard, a place that held more childhood memories than I cared to admit. And now, finally, one that would be mine. The sun broke through the clouds just as I stepped out in my dress, the warmth like a quiet benediction, and as I walked down the short aisle, I could feel eyes on me, not distracted, not wandering, but truly on me, and that feeling alone was worth every ounce of tension that had preceded it. But even as I stood beside Mark, my fingers laced with his, my vows steady and certain, I could feel the other thing, this undercurrent of expectation, of waiting. Like everyone there knew, this wasn't just a wedding, but the opening act in a far larger family drama. And sure enough, it didn't take long for that expectation to be met. About 15 minutes into the reception, while people were milling around the cocktail tables and the first champagne glasses were being filled, my phone buzzed on the edge of the table where I'd left it. I wouldn't have answered, but I saw her name flash across the screen, and something in me, a flicker of curiosity maybe, or the morbid desire to see just how far she'd go, made me pick it up. Emily's voice, when it came through, was low and hoarse, the kind of voice you only get when you've been crying or screaming or both. "I cannot believe you did this," she said, no greeting, no lead-in, just straight fury wrapped in disbelief. And I could almost picture her pacing in some pastel-decorated room, surrounded by untouched party favors and lukewarm mini quiches, her hand probably resting on the swell of her belly like a prop. "You mean I got married?" I asked, keeping my tone as even as I could manage, though my hands trembled slightly with the sheer absurdity of the moment. "You know what I mean, Cassie," she snapped, her breath catching like she was either trying not to cry or trying not to yell loud enough for someone else to hear. "You could have picked any date, any weekend. Why today? Why my baby shower?" The question landed with all the weight of irony I couldn't begin to unpack. "Because you chose my engagement dinner to make your announcement," I replied, the calmness in my voice no longer forced but earned, built brick by brick from every moment I'd spent wondering how much I was allowed to matter in my own life. "That was different," she shot back. And there it was, the moment she cracked, the moment the facade slipped and the entitlement showed itself for what it really was. "This was supposed to be my day." I let that sit in the air for a moment before I said, slowly and clearly, Every day can't be yours, Emily. Eventually, someone else gets to go first. There was silence then, long and stretching, and I thought maybe she had hung up. But then I heard a soft, clipped inhale, like she was trying to decide between lashing out or letting go. "I hope you're happy," she said finally. And this time her voice was so small, so clipped and bitter, that it made my stomach twist. Not with regret, but with the recognition that for once, she wasn't the one holding the reins. "I am," I said simply, and I meant it. I didn't expect her to respond, and she didn't. The call ended abruptly, and I stood there for a moment, phone in hand, watching my friends and family raise glasses, hearing someone call out for the photographer, and feeling not triumphant, not victorious exactly, but grounded, like I had finally stepped into the space I had always been told to shrink from. The day unfolded in that strange duality, my wedding happening in the very moment my sister's fantasy of an all eyes on her baby shower collapsed under the weight of her own choices. I didn't revel in her disappointment, but I also didn't shy away from the reality that I had claimed something that was mine, unapologetically and without waiting for permission. And as the evening wound down, as we stood in the golden light and took photos and laughed over spilled drinks and slightly off-key toasts, I knew that even if Emily never spoke to me again, even if this moment widened the gulf between us to something irreparable, I had no regrets. Because somewhere between revenge and justice, there was a place where dignity lived, and I had finally found it. The day had unfolded with a kind of surreal perfection, the kind you only notice in hindsight, where the skies stay stubbornly clear despite a gloomy forecast. The flowers arrive a shade more vivid than you remembered ordering, and the speeches, those carefully worded attempts at sentiment, managed to strike that delicate balance between emotion and laughter without tipping into awkward oversharing. But even with everything going so smoothly, so precisely as it should, there was a hum beneath it all, a subtle frequency only I could hear that reminded me this wasn't just a celebration. It was a culmination, a quiet, carefully orchestrated reckoning that had taken its time arriving. By the time the sun had dipped low enough to cast long golden shadows across the lawn, the photos had been taken, the cake cut, and the first dance danced. I felt the weight of the day settle into my bones. Not as exhaustion, but as something deeper, a kind of groundedness I hadn't felt in years. Yet even then, even in that fullness, I knew the story wasn't finished, not really. Because although the wedding had unfolded exactly as planned, and my name, for once, had been the one printed on every program, called out in every toast, and etched into every memory of the day, there was still a presence that hovered at the edge of it all, uninvited, unwelcome perhaps, but undeniably there. Emily had not shown up, of course, no surprise there. Her silence following our last conversation had been thunderous in its finality, a kind of definitive punctuation mark on a relationship that had long been built on imbalance and unspoken resentments. But despite her absence, she still managed to infiltrate the day in small, deliberate ways, like an echo of a song you can't quite forget, no matter how loud the music gets. I found the card tucked into the guestbook table sometime after dinner, right before we lit the sparklers, and posed for the final round of photos. It was smaller than the rest, cream-colored with gold trim, folded in a way that suggested hurried hands and conflicted intent. My name was written on the front in her handwriting, familiar, slanted, a little too perfect, and inside no greeting, no congratulations, just a single line scribbled in dark ink across the page. "Good luck raising both these families under your spotlight." There was no signature, no flourish, nothing but those 13 words that managed to say more than any confrontation could have. I stared at the sentence, letting it unfold in my mind, twisting it from every angle like a puzzle I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to solve. Part of me wanted to laugh, at the absurdity, at the drama, at the sheer theatrical spite of it all. But another part, the one still tethered to the idea of sisterhood and shared childhoods, and the complicated web of expectations we'd grown tangled in, felt something colder. What did she mean exactly? Was it a jab, a warning, a bitter farewell disguised as a prophecy? I couldn't tell. And maybe that was the point. I folded the card, slipped it into my clutch without showing Mark or anyone else, and returned to the party with a smile that was only slightly more practiced than before. The rest of the night played out in shimmering wine-drenched fragments, laughter spilling from open mouths, high heels abandoned on the dance floor, my father holding back tears during our final dance, and Mark whispering, "You're incredible," into my ear, like he really truly believed it. And in those moments, I did feel incredible, not just because I was a bride, but because I had finally taken something back for myself, drawn a line in the sand that I didn't immediately erase with guilt or compromise. Still, as the night ended and the guests trickled out, and the cleanup crew began their quiet, methodical dismantling of the day's magic, I couldn't shake that sentence from my mind. I lay awake next to Mark in the dark, my body exhausted but my thoughts sharp, wondering what it meant to raise two families under one spotlight. Was she implying that my marriage had inherited the weight of both our legacies? Our shared parents, our fractured closeness, her unborn child whose existence now orbited the same timeline as my wedding? Or had she meant it as a curse, a warning that the attention I fought for would become a burden, not a prize? I didn't know, and perhaps I never would. That was the thing about Emily. She never delivered closure, only riddles. She left emotional fingerprints on everything she touched and then walked away like she hadn't been there at all. Months passed. We adjusted to married life with the quiet, slow certainty that comes when two people are deeply aligned but still navigating the surprise of having actually pulled it off. My mother mentioned Emily less and less, but when she did, her tone was cautious, like someone speaking through a fog, unsure of whether the person she was describing still belonged to the family in quite the same way. The baby was born in late August. A boy, healthy and apparently beautiful, according to the single photo I received via text from my father, who didn't say anything else except, "Thought you'd want to know." I didn't respond. I stared at the photo for a long time, at the tiny hand curled against Emily's chest, at the tired look on her face that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite peace. There was no smile, no sparkle, just a rawness that seemed honest in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. And I wondered then if, beneath all her posturing and power plays, Emily had felt alone in that moment, if she had looked around and realized the cost of always needing to be the center of everything. But I didn't reach out, not because I was angry, though I still was, in quieter, less volatile ways, but because I had nothing to say that wouldn't feel like picking a scab or pressing a bruise. Some distances aren't meant to be closed, not right away. Some silences are the only way to keep from reopening old wounds. And yet, sometimes, in the quiet of early morning, when Mark is still asleep and the world hasn't yet begun its daily hum, I think about that card, those 13 words, and the way they've lodged themselves in my memory, like a thorn too small to remove. I think about the path I chose and the one I walked away from, about the sister I no longer speak to, and the version of myself I finally embraced. I don't regret it, but I don't celebrate it either. Because revenge, when it comes wrapped in wedding dresses and guest lists, doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it just feels like a choice you made while standing at the edge of a very old map, with no guarantee of what lay beyond.